Humans are so bad at understanding what's happening. I mean, we're miles better than every other species, but I think the gap between us and, say, the chimps has given us a hubris to think that we are somehow much closer to understanding reality than we are. Because at the end of the day, we're also animals that have evolved on this planet for our own games of survival. And those games don't demand that we understand everything exhaustively. They don't require that we understand truth. They don't require that we have the sensory processing to know everything that's occurring in our environments. And I think that it's a reality that we forget too often. It's a situation that doesn't seem to be in our collective consciousness enough of the time. We're going around acting as though we understand reality in its fullness. And I can understand why. I mean, if you were to constantly interrogate everything in the way that I like to, you'd never get anything done in the way that I don't. But as I'm sure you all know, our brains are predictive machines where we learn established patterns and then map out what we think is going to happen. And like all other animals, we're evolved to be efficient at what we do. And that doesn't mean committing all of the kilojoules that we have in our bodies to understanding things correctly. It means operating with predictive algorithms to navigate the world to best position ourselves to survive. And while you might think that to best understand reality would be the best way to survive, whilst that's true at a meta level, at the individual level and at the communal level, that mostly means understanding reality well enough so that you can navigate the group and stay well positioned within the group and that the group keeps accruing resources, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's less room evolutionary for the cognitive bandwidth required to understand the huge long-term existential threats. I think that's something you see all the time. But also at the immediate level, we're not very good at attributing causes to their effects. And we're not very good at attributing the complexity of reality to the perceived state of the world around us. When something terrible happens, one of the first instincts is to find who or what is to blame. And normally, who or what is to blame, just by coincidence, happens to fall into the framework of whoever it is or whatever it is that you didn't like anyway. If you're at the further ends of ideological capture in the US and there's a hurricane, if you're on the left, you might immediately declare the hurricane as a result of climate change. If you're at the Christian conservative end of the spectrum, you might think it's the wrath of God. And if you're in the broader middle of the spectrum, but still have a political leaning, I'm sure that you think that whatever the government response is either adequate or inadequate, depending on whether it's your team or not in power. And this type of phenomenon is something you see across everything from small individual setbacks to large cataclysmic social phenomena. We have a real capacity to misattribute the cause of something. And we usually do that to pin the things that we don't like or don't feel good about upon our enemies. And our enemies are normally people that are different from us. This is really obvious in instances of racial differences because they're easy ones to pick out. So if somebody says house prices are high in Australia because Chinese people are buying houses, it's very obvious that rather than unpacking the complexity of the situation, someone is just outing themselves as someone who doesn't like Chinese people. But that's just one of a million examples. And everything from small personal grievances to large social phenomena, people are terrible at identifying cause and effect and really, really good at waging a moral warfare because it feels good. We're equipped to do it. We all fall into it. I absolutely fall into it as much as everybody else. It feels right to identify who is wrong and to pin the bad things that we don't like upon them, and inversely to disregard the responsibility of both ourselves and the groups that we like for the things that we perceive as negative, both in our own lives and across society. So today I'm going to be looking into a few instances of moral warfare, and hopefully just by going across those, it'll be obvious why it's not a great idea to fall into that trap thinking, and hopefully offers a few flags so the next time you indulge in it yourself, you could think, hang on a sec, I could probably be doing better in how I perceive this problem and be more forgiving of the people that I don't like. If this is your first time or you're a regular listener, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the Chris Andrew podcast. Just before we get underway, I want to say thank you so much to my patrons and welcome to Jess High, who has joined at the committed tier. Woo, 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 woo. That could be you. Or if you're Jess listening, that is you. Really appreciate you and all of the patron support. Couldn't keep the show running otherwise. Let's listen to some music and I'll see you on the other side with an exploration of moral warfare. So the topic of moral warfare, as I'm looking at it, is one that I picked up from California psychologist John Tooby. When I was searching for his writings to refresh myself for this episode, I was sad to learn he passed in 2023. And I have had an idle back burner, a to-do item for many years to write to him to thank him for his works and writings because they've influenced so much of my life. And I was gutted to see that he died, especially so recently. And so I'm taking it as a reminder for myself, but it's one that I share with you to write to the people that have influenced you to let them know, because I know personally how much it is appreciated. And also, it's just a nice thing to get to do for yourself while you have the opportunity. Anyway, that aside, John Tooby is an evolutionary psychologist, and he wrote an essay that I linked to quite a lot, just a few pages: Nexus Causality, Moral Warfare, and Misattribution Arbitrage. I won't go into it too much, but in this, he highlights our proclivity for waging moral warfare in our misattribution of things. Although it's a simple concept that I'm sure you've come up against, I think the more that we can all do to liberate ourselves from the worst versions of it, not only the happier we will be, but the better lives we can build and the better society we can build, which is why I'm interested in unpacking it a little bit today. And as I said from the top, it's that instinct to pin the things that you don't like upon the people you don't like as responsible. But more broadly, it comes from the general difficulty that we have in understanding how things occur. You could pick any major event from history and there'll be large collections of people, if not a majority, if not almost everybody, who have a completely wrong idea for how they occurred. And that wrong idea will inevitably involve putting the blame on a group or individual or circumstance that is collectively repudiated. Many years ago at Woodford Folk Festival, I was helping to host a morning show there, and I got rambling about this stuff. And one of the guests, I'm so sorry if you are a listener, I've forgotten your name, a former professor of sustainability and environment in Queensland, he said to me that every complex problem has a simple explanation, and it's always wrong. And I know I'm railing against shorthand heuristics, but that is a very handy one to keep into your pocket every time that anyone proclaims to have a simple answer to the complex problems that we face. But where we fail to understand things because of their complexity, we also, when it comes to things that are distasteful, pin the blame, and we usually do it incorrectly. Aside from the fact that we are persecuting individuals or groups, even just socially, for things for which they're not wholly or even partially responsible, is that we stop interrogating them. It becomes a fixed certainty where we know what's occurring and we don't need to interrogate it more. We can go on and continue acting in our lives, usually oblivious to whatever the actual causes of whatever problem is. I don't want to leave you hanging without examples, so I'll start to get into some. If you see somebody who's in the public sphere, such as in Australia, Pauline Hanson, but there's any number of these figures across Europe, saying that their society is ruined because of Muslims, most people don't feel that way. So then you see her speaking like that and you find it alienating. And not only is it alienating, she's actually a villain who's ruining everything. And racism is the real problem that we have in our society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This sort of discourse impoverishes everybody on all sides, obviously. And that's why I picked that example. But if you pick something like housing, that's another one. You know, housing has become more expensive across the west of the world, so expensive that it's prohibitive. And so people who are locked out of housing, it's very common to hear refrains like it's all the boomers that have done everything, or the government doesn't care about us, or whatever. And of course, there are elements that are true. Whereas from the boomer side, they see that and they say, well, young people don't work hard enough. It's safe. They buy all these things that we didn't used to buy. Which is sort of true. Certainly, I wouldn't have thought to the degree of $1 million Australian dollars for housing, but also it's the government's fault for not releasing more land to build things. It's very hard for me to get into this mindset on this argument because of my own position on it. You know, they certainly find the emotionality of the conversation alienating and are therefore, at least as a collective cohort, not sympathetic to doing the things that actually solve the problem, which is complex and because of the amount of time it's been going on for, will require a radical shift that most people who would lose from it are not willing to make. So we have the stasis. Another obvious one, which is sort of related to the example that I gave earlier with the hurricane, is climate change. It's a complex dynamic because everybody has a foot in the arena, but almost never in the public sphere do you hear people say, it's me and people that are like me and the groups that I'm a part of that are the problem here. You sort of famously have corporations saying, well, it's individual responsibility, it's their fault. You have governments saying, we're doing our bit, it's other governments' fault. And you have regular people saying, oh, it's all the big corporations' fault. Obviously, it's everybody's fault. And of course, we have different degrees of impact and responsibility based on the power that we have. But you don't see a majority of actors in this arena taking commensurate ownership of their proportion of responsibilities. And not just that, there was, at least from 2010 to 2020, discourse that was very heavily focused on pointing fingers about who is responsible, taking actions that required other people to assume their share of the responsibility. And of course, like if you look at a graph of what's happened ever since, the pollutants that we put into our only atmosphere have not only not radically been reduced, but what we're doing as a species has continued to increase to our detriment. I think it should be noted. Another great one, which is a bit more of a hot button topic, is the wars that are going on at the moment. Israel and their wars on the various groups of neighboring peoples in the Middle East and people within Israel, and Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's very easy to switch on to a conversation upon these topics in any fora or an explainer in any fora and see the thick trunk of attribution being squarely placed on one group or the other, and it's always the group that you don't like. So if you're sympathetic to the very legitimate Ukrainian claims of distress in the war that they're in, then everything that Russia does is villainous and must as such bear the full responsibility for ending it. And vice versa, if you're sympathetic with the Russian position, then it's Ukraine and the West that are responsible for all elements of that conflict and should be taking on all elements of its repair. Same with Israel, Hamas. Pick your team. The other team is villainous and evil and vile, and our team, despite claims that they are doing things that are villainous and evil and vile, they're actually really good and they're the victims. True for every conflict. We're seemingly hardwired to want to be a part of a side if something is important to us and something we think is bad is happening. And once we've picked our side, we really do put the blinkers on and stop thinking and listening, which robs us of the capacity to solve these things. I think it's very clear that's a big part of why these problems haven't been solved. I'm not suggesting they're otherwise necessarily tractable, but from the way in which you see the discourse occurring, even at the very top level from the people who are responsible, it's the same moral warfare trend where the language mostly surrounds the culpability of our enemies, the injustice that's occurred to us, which is just not a way to solve problems where you have a disagreement, unfortunately, because there are real world mechanical requirements to get from conflict to resolution that are not being undertaken whilst that mindset is employed. One really wonderful study that illustrates this is there was a group of psychologists, and I don't know how they're allowed to do this, but they, maybe they were just acting, but they got football fans of various teams to watch people who are wearing the football shirt of the team that they support to receive electric shocks. And they wired up their brains so they could see what was occurring. And what they found was that if you are watching someone from the football team that you like receive an electric shock, you experience pain. But if you're watching someone from a rival football team be administered an electric shock, you experience not only no pain, but pleasure. The pleasure centers light up. And I think that is maybe a perfect illustration of how, I want to say stupid, but it's not really fair because everybody's like this, but how limited we are in our capacity to neutrally assess situations. We all have teams, we all have in-groups and out-groups. I found it really funny when I lived in Brunswick that, is a community that is very welcoming of different cultures because it is so multicultural, but then the other that they create is developers and gentrification. So even in communities that are actively identifying as being inclusive and welcoming, it's still important for them to find a group that are ruining everything. And it's, of course, the people that are coming in and changing the natural order of things, which is for there to be 28% Italians, 23% Lebanon, whatever arbitrary lines you want to draw. We all find these groups and we all want to protect the ones that we like and punish the ones that we don't like, which is, of course, a great way to run a society that sucks, but no way to actually solve the problems that we face, but are larger and more complex than our monkey brains give them credit for. The tricky thing with this is that it's very easy to see where people are committing sins of misattribution and waging moral warfare to feel good. It's easy to see that in people that are not like us. I assume, and I hope correctly, that none of my listeners are particularly sympathetic with Andrew Tate and his audience. And so as a result, it's easy for us to see how incorrect and reductive and harmful the discourse that he is the progenitor of and represents is for people. It's much harder to separate out the uselessness of our own instinctive moral warfare that we want to wage. And I don't want to assume who you are, but maybe you think all politicians are corrupt and evil, or all corporations are vampires, or like whatever it might be. As that Professor Dean said, all complex problems have a simple explanation and they're always wrong. So even if in the instance where you think, oh, there's a lot of plastic pollution, Coca-Cola produces the bottles, they should be responsible for that. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. There will be other elements, though. They're also not opening their products and throwing them straight into rivers. That's the rest of us. They're also not making a billion products a day because nobody buys them. They're making them because we all buy them. There's a dynamic there where people who buy them, the governments that allow them the jurisdiction to sell them, and of course the company themselves, if we collectively think that having plastic all through our water systems is a bad thing, then we all have a role to play in addressing that. And yes, those who are manufacturing all the plastic for sure have a bigger role to play than one person who throws the bottle into the river. But if there's 100,000 people doing it every day, that's also a constituency that needs to be considered in addressing this problem. And for that particular problem, I think we do have that level of understanding and engagement over time. But it's something that's been occurring for decades and we still haven't solved it. I'm sure that this year will be one of the worst ever in terms of how much plastic we shove into our water. And it's not for a lack of people identifying other people as being responsible. That is the easy thing to do in any problem. This is a hypothetical because I don't have any aunts, but say if you have two aunts that are arguing over the inheritance or something like that, they may never speak to each other again because they might identify the other party as wholly wrong. And then what do? You rob yourself of decades of talking to your sister. Nobody wins from these shorthand absolutist positions. But most annoyingly for me is how much of this space, how much of the time we spend talking to each other, both at interpersonal levels and then at the collective level, is clogged up by this moral warfare. I'm going to pick two examples just because they're ones that are across my radar just from the last few weeks. As a former comedian, I couldn't help but look at all the outrage that occurred in response to the comedians doing the Saudi Arabia Comedy Festival. And I think regardless of what you think about comedians going and performing in Saudi Arabia, it was the fixation upon it that stood out to me in that, okay, here's some comedians going and making a lot of money by participating in what's no doubt a soft power operation to lend legitimacy to a pretty rough regime in society. But what struck me about it was obviously very tempting for everybody to jump onto that and to say these comedians and this festival are rotten and evil. But there's no equivalent interrogation of why does the House of Saud have the resources to do this? Okay, Jim Owen's going over there and making $100,000 or whatever. Maybe they have the money to pay him this because everyone everyone that they know, everyone that's made anything that you've touched today collectively sends over billions and billions of dollars every single day to this exact society for the oil that they are sitting on. We're not hearing about a comedy festival in Burundi and railing against that because they're poor, because we don't all send all of the money that we have for something that we desperately want to have at the cheapest price possible all the time. And so in this instance where there's a complex dynamic occurring, we've identified the enemies, and it's the famous comedians. And that absolves us because the situation is rightfully distasteful and frustrating, but it is also complex. It's a dynamic, and it's one that we are all undoubtedly, whoever you are, complicit in some degree. You've got a share in that company. And it's much easier to project the distress and distaste of bad things for existing upon visible targets than it is to even buy one less t-shirt or whatever it might be. And I'm not saying that it means there shouldn't be a discourse around, whether or not people participate in these operations and, what that looks like and what decisions you would have made for yourself. Those are interesting conversations that are worth having because how role models behave, how people that everybody are looking at, whether they choose to be or not, they are inevitably role models and their behavior has consequence, a consequence greater than the individuality of their actions, which leads to the next one that was so striking to me this last month, which is the social media posts of Bailey Smith. If you're not across this, Bailey Smith is an Australian rules footballer who plays with Geelong Cats, and he is obviously quite extroverted and very attractive and very popular on social media. And he did a post with another teammate who was dressed as the journalist Caroline Wilson. He said, "Best Caro's looked," and then did a horny emoji, splashing water and angsty face or something. I don't know how to describe it. But for this, he was pilloried by the media, and every AFL forum and Melbourne News forum had articles on it, and there was so much ink spilled about this, and there were such small, I would say, non-transgressions, but people were debating the nature of that. He was criticized as being homophobic. He was criticized as being sexist. He was criticized as being sexually lewd, and these things are just so low level for the behaviors that people actually do, which is the point I want to get to with this stuff. These fixations where we wage moral warfare around something we have no control over and only affects us as much as we let it, it fills the space where otherwise we could be talking about anything. Like symbols matter, but actions matter more. And where we worry about Jamoan making a few jokes in Riyadh and talk about that, it substitutes the space in which we worry about burning billions of barrels of oil a day and using that to underpin all of our societies. And also all of that wealth, by the way, goes to upholding a pretty nasty regime that does horrible things that we don't like. And the problem of the thin gruel discourse, where we think that it's the comedians that are at fault, and we think that Bailey Smith is responsible for homophobia and sexism in society, is that we have the discourse at that level, and that stands in as a substitute for caring about the issue, where we think, oh, I've discharged my emotionality around this. I've discharged my social responsibility. I've identified the group that is wrong, and that is the homophobes. And I've identified the group that is wrong, and that is the comedians who are happy to be a part of this soft power marketing exercise. And in doing so, I've discharged all of my engagement, responsibility, and capacity to impact this. And like, obviously, now we're 20 years into social media. It's a behavior we're familiar with, where people see posting, commenting, sharing articles or whatever as a substitute for meaningful action and engagement. Obviously, there's a dynamic where that's a part of things, but it's only a small part of things relative to real world action. And we are all impoverished by having low level discourse that focuses on the successful waging of moral warfare, where we prosecute, oh, this person is so bad because they made a joke. Like, it's fucking insane, really. And this is the exact issue of indulging in the waging of moral warfare, is that we're inevitably focusing on the wrong thing to an insane degree. It's like coming home to your house and your house is on fire and you notice that the lawn is a bit long. You're like, oh, I should mow the lawn. This is a big problem. That sounds like a stupid thing to do, but that to me is what it looks like when the collective is waging moral warfare around things that are very important. For me at the moment, I've been jaw drop shocked by everything that's happened in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The situation is so bad, and the efforts to end it are not commensurate with the state of the situation. And I think it's because once something is going, we get used to it. If 1,000 people died on the roads in Adelaide this week, it would be shocking and everyone would mobilize to do something about it. But 1,000 people die on the front lines of that war, and it's like, well, that's a war and that's what's occurring. And, we're trying to end it. And it's actually them who should be ending it. And it's them who are in the wrong. And of course, them who I'm referring to will be obvious to you, depending on the position that you identify as taking within that particular conflict. It's the same with the much lower level stuff of Bailey Smith and the Saudi Comedy Festival. I mean, Bailey Smith, if you were to line up every 23-year-old man in Australia and looked at the worst thing that they did in the last couple of weeks, I doubt that Bailey Smith would be in even the top 80% of those. Or at least for his social media posts. I don't know what else he's doing in his life. I think that we feel like these things are proxies for solving problems, but where we give our attention defines our capacity to solve problems and betrays our level of understanding of problems. And of course, I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic with why we do this. Complex problems are so named for a reason. If they were easy to understand, they would be solved. And we want to be able to do something. So we reach for whatever is in the grab bag. But too often, that's what feels good. And too often that involves vilifying the people that we don't like, whether they're from an ethnic, religious, political, sports, gender, whatever group it is. What a coincidence does it happen to be that it's always the group that is nothing like how we are ourselves. So if I've convinced you that this is an issue of concern, what do you do to take away and do something about it in your own life? The bad news is it's something you're definitely going to continue to do anyway. The good news is that you can know that that is something within you for certain. The proclivity to accidentally, willfully misunderstand and to feel good about attributing blame to those who are not like you is inevitably going to happen. And so just having that as an awareness is already, I think, a huge win. Maybe there's a small red flag that raises in the back of your mind the next time you're blaming all the traffic on the Muslims. I mean, I don't think that's my listenership so much, but the next time, whatever's a big problem in your life, if you're able to hone in on, oh my God, this is all because of my parents, or this is all because of the government, or this is all because of Donald Trump, or whatever it might be. Attributing bad things, you might even be 99% right, or you might even be 100% right, but it likely isn't. And where it isn't, you're robbing yourself of giving focus to the areas of capacity or the other actors of control that are maybe feeding into a problem, which will in many instances include yourself. And so you don't want to rob yourself of your own chances to navigate something. And where you are railing against something that is 100% for certain the fault of another actor, even in those situations, by spending your energy on waging moral warfare against that stuff is an indulgence that might make you feel good, but it is also likely robbing you of the time to integrate the reality of whatever it is that you don't like and to navigate the world as it is in ways that minimize your exposure to that or helps ameliorate the worst of its impacts upon you or whatever it is that you care about. And so to that end, I would suggest that if you notice that when you encounter particular stories of what's going on in the world or encounter the things that you don't like in your own life, and it's very obvious to you who's wrong, And I'm sure you have all these reasons that are why that are more likely than not to be completely true. There will inevitably be more complex things at play. And the fact that you fixate upon certain things ultimately is a clue to tell you something about yourself as well. I know that for years, I really railed against the injustice of private schools. They really annoyed me, their existence. I mean, I'm not thrilled about them today, but for me, that was a proxy for being frustrated that my own parents hadn't set me up for doing well in life in ways that other people had that for them. And even though I didn't articulate it like this, I definitely leaned on it as an excuse for not better navigating the situation and many opportunities that I have in front of it. Did that benefit me? No. Did that close the public private school divide? No, it's bigger than ever. Did that benefit me as a person? No. So, where you do find that you are attracted to the temptation of indulging in making absolutist moral declarations about the state of things, whether they're related to you personally or at a metasocial level, those are clues that can point back to, oh, why am I so fixated on this? Why is this so important to me? What else could be going on here? Because particularly if you're fixated on things that you have no control over, because there's any number of things that you could be completely right to be really frustrated by and really depressed by and really angry about. Like there's any number of those injustices constantly occurring in the world, but if you are fixated upon them beyond the point of utility or where they're supplanting engaging in the things that you can do in your own life, especially at the detriment to your well-being, take that as a clue that there's probably also something else there. But that's beyond the absolute scope of what I wanted to talk about with moral warfare today. I hope that in your own life it's useful to see and to help each other navigate this stuff, because there's any number of times where the worst excesses of indulging in moral warfare has been mitigated just by some kind interrogation of friends, like, and why is that so disturbing for you, or whatever it might be. So I'm sure it's something that you'll see in others and hopefully be able to look at with kindness and to help, so that we can help each other to navigate past the worst of this instinct that I would say has probably from the dawn of our species infected everything that we do to our detriment. Because there are big problems that we do need to be solving, and there are better ways of solving the problems that we have. I think that that's obvious. And I think that this little bit of toolkit, thank you, John Tooby, for articulating it as that, can go a long way to navigating us to a better life. If you think that the Chris Andrew podcast is something that's navigating you to a better life, thank you. Please like and share this episode. There's a big archive now of episodes on a lot of topics. If any of them have moved you, please do send them to the people in your life that might appreciate them, and do those. And if you would take a moment, please, to like, subscribe, all of those things. They really do make a big difference to my capacity to do more of these. And if you're really interested in supporting the show, head on over to patreon.com/Endry. There's a free tier, but there's also paid tiers where you can just back the work that I'm doing to do these. It's only going to grow. And the better that stuff goes, the bigger signal I have to be able to give more time to researching, producing, and delivering more episodes to you guys. Wherever you are, I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care of yourselves and each other.